Hello and welcome to this video looking at just how well, or not so well, a baker's yeast performs when trying to produce ethanol. We are, for all intents and purposes, trying to show how efficient or inefficient it is to use a common baking yeast for making ethanol. This is a result of the somewhat common claim that you can just add yeast, any yeast for that matter, found in your kitchen to a fermenter full of sugar and get ethanol to the same degree as a dedicated yeast strain, but without the cost, hassle, and effort of using anything but a common baker's yeast. Think of this. You go along and you pick up a tin, a sachet, or whatever it is of yeast intended for making bread, and you pitch this into your fermenter. Now, you theoretically have the ability to make ethanol, or moonshine more accurately, but let's stick with this theoretically correct terminology for now. The position is that you can get just as good a result, admittedly not necessarily exactly as good, but good enough to make up for the differences. To test this, we have a simple setup. A bottle with a bung and airlock. We would have used 50ml Falcon tubes if they were available, but poor planning has come back to haunt us, so we're using 250ml glass bottles. To this we've added 100 grams of sugar. This amount is excessive to what the yeast could ferment if it were a dedicated strain meant for making ethanol washes. We've chosen this as it removes the limiting substrate consideration. For all practical reasons, high ethanol yeast should produce 20% alcohol by volume. Therefore, it should be using roughly the same volume, by weight at least, of sugar. Essentially, it's a 1-to-1 transition. We've then added 40% sugar by weight, because that means we now have twice as much sugar as should theoretically be needed. This will mean that at the end there will be a considerable amount of undissolved sugar, but we can adjust for that when we do our equations. With the sugar added to the bottle, we then add a tablespoon or approximately 5 grams of each kind of yeast. This is followed by a teaspoon of yeast nutrient. And finally, water to make up the volume to the necessary quarter litre, or roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 7 fluid ounces. This is a fermentation as per all normal means. Effectively, you'll be doing the same thing with a regular fermenter, just on a grander scale. Roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 100 times. The fermentation was left in a warm place to ferment, as is required, and that took roughly a week. It is notable to point out now that the baker's yeast finished significantly more early than the brewer's yeast did. A comparison is run at the same time, with both the dedicated ethanol strain of the yeast and the commercial supplied strain of yeast for high ethanol production. It's the same volume of sugar, the different yeast of yeast, at least so, but effectively the same volume of yeast, the same amount of yeast nutrient, and we go on from there. We started with a roughly 1.04 initial gravity reading, and each of the tests was run 3 times. The results really aren't all that surprising. We get a very clear difference. First of all, the question we have from this is whether or not that difference is really meaningful. The answer is yes, and that should be obvious when you see the results side by side or in the same graph. You are getting around 4 times as much ethanol from a dedicated brewer's yeast strain than you can get from a baker's yeast strain. A part of this is that the dedicated yeast strain can utilize far more of the sugar in the wash for far longer, where with the baker's yeast we get a drop of about 0.04, in this term specific gravity, or units of specific gravity. With the brewer's yeast, we get a significantly greater drop, somewhere in the ballpark of about 4 times as much, which kind of makes sense given we get 4 times as much ethanol. So that's the first dead giveaway. Now, there is some, let's say, problems with our study design, primarily in that it's very small in volume, mostly to make this as concise and simple to understand as possible, and something you can, if you wish, repeat at home. What you need to be aware of is that we never actually hit the ceiling of what the dedicated high ethanol strain should have been capable of. That is 20% alcohol by volume. We got somewhere between 18 and 19%. Now, this is only just below that threshold, so it's likely to be just a limitation of the size of the vessel rather than anything major. But do be aware that it is at least some sort of indicator that the experiment could be done better. In short, you are going to get more alcohol from a dedicated ethanol strain of yeast, as we mentioned, 4 times as much, And so it is a very good case to be made here that simply due to the nature of how you get ethanol out of a wash like this, the time required and everything else, you not just benefit more from being able to use more sugar and more completely, but you are going to be more efficient in what you are doing, which is a notable consideration if you're limited on space. The other is that if you're going to be distilling this, for the most part all the sugars that are left over basically become useless for you. You could theoretically reuse the wash, but there's all sorts of issues with doing that we're not going to get into here. But be aware that because of how this all works, simply put, baker's yeast does not give enough yield to be worth the use and effort involved. On top of this, we don't have the means of testing for it, but we can extrapolate out from other published research in peer-reviewed journals. Those studies have found that a baker's yeast makes much more methanol, it has fusel oils, and so on, and these, beyond the fact that, well, in the case of methanol can make you blind, make for a very bad drink. So if you want to distill this and use it for producing some sort of consumable ethanol product, a baker's yeast is not good in that respect. So we add that on top of the other issues regarding efficiency and the fact that it doesn't really achieve as much. You have very few reasons to use baker's yeast, with the exception of not having any other option. If that is the case, and that's a very big if here, based on the available results we've shown you, there is one thing you can do to make more use out of the, let's say, fermentation as it is. Use a much lower amount of sugar in the wash. What we mean by that is, rather than aim for a high ethanol yield from this, aim for a lower yield of ethanol per fermentation, but the baker's yeast should be able to completely utilize all of the sugar. This means that you are going to be able to run more fermentations with a, say, finite amount of sugar, but you're not going to be wasting any of it either. Therefore, you get the best results with the minimum of waste. And theoretically, the yeast involved should be able to be reused, and theoretically again, the big theoretical there, you can repitch the yeast continuously and almost select for traits that would make it more ethanol tolerant, theoretically building up the necessary, let's say, mutations that would allow you to have a higher, not necessarily high, but certainly higher, ethanol tolerant yeast from a baker's yeast. This is why baker's yeast is, generally speaking though, not a good choice, no matter how well it might work to your mind. You might get some similar levels of alcohol, but that's very unlikely. However, you will also get a raft of unwanted products, which is very likely. Products that will turn your moonshine into an undrinkable mess at best, and something that will make you blind, in the bad sense, at worst, and possibly dead, but definitely not good to drink. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.